start this video. Okay, my name is Arsenette. I have a blog named Rambling Rican. I've been, on YouTube, I think, 14 years? 15? Something like that. It's been a long time. And I mentioned in the previous video, now I think it was in January, we're in March now, almost April, yay. I've been struggling to figure out how to do this video, and one of the problems that I have is that I like making sure that I have like all the information ever and then just like cram it in there, and then I go into this loop of researching and then that becomes obsolete, and then the next research thing. So then I decided, you know what, let me just try to get this as simple as possible and go from there. So this all revolves around the Supreme Court case, and everybody's like, what the heck are you talking about, a Supreme Court case? And so in order for me to explain why this is so personal is to explain something that I thought was rhetorical, that didn't need to be explained. Then I realized it's just, I hate to use the word ignorant because ignorant now has sort of like a derogatory for its lack of knowledge. They just don't know. Like literally they don't know. So it revolves around Puerto Ricans. And Puerto Ricans, everybody knows, are American citizens. And that's about the extent of their knowledge. They don't know where we came from. We don't know how many there are. So to put it into context, the island of Puerto Rico is something like 3.2 million American citizens. And the rest of us are in the United States. And we're like 5.8. It's just, it was so cute. I actually heard in a recent YouTube video, again, me going down the rabbit trail of how many of us are there, and then you would hear like, oh my gosh, someone's Puerto Rican. I said, but there's so small amounts. But damn, we're so loud and we can't fit all on the island.
When it comes to like Latin cultures, I know pretty much nothing.
Nothing at all.
I know very little.
You've never encountered anything?
I mean, what do you mean by that?
Have you ever met a Spanish person in real life?
Yeah, of course. I lived right next to Spain when I was growing up. I've been to Spain.
No, you never met a Puerto Rican. Oh my god, my body died.
No, I've never met a Puerto Rican. Oh, your body did die. I feel like Puerto Ricans aren't that common. Wait, no, I've probably met a Puerto Rican in the US. What am I saying? What?
What? My god.
The population of Puerto Rico is 3 million. That's the same as Wales, so it's not that populated.
Carajo, porque chiquita. No cabemos más.
I can't believe it.
Just because Mouse gets angry doesn't mean that Mouse is right.
Mouse is always right.
Mouse is never right.
Ella está correcta.
Mouse
en
is
este momento
always
está
right.
correcta. Y las madres
Holding me
siempre
hostage,
están
Mouse. Can I
correctas.
go?
And so, yeah, I'm going all over the place already. I'm first generation Puerto Rican, or I should say first generation American. And I have to say that distinction because there really is a difference. I'll be half a century this year in August. Yay. And it's interesting when you look at the perspective historically of what my generation represented. We were the generation that started after the big exodus, the great exodus in the late 1940s, early 1950s, that actually had my mom going when she was a child and my dad going into the late 60s when he was able to afford to leave as an adult. But there was a lot of issues that arose when President Truman decided to basically botch up already a bigger problem anyway, which is something called the territories, and turned Puerto Rico into a commonwealth. And it's really interesting with this Supreme Court case that Justice Breyer, who is now going to be the one that's retiring this year, had like the best line ever. And I was surprised hearing it from the perspective of a Supreme Court justice.
Sometimes when Puerto Rico is included in a program, it's defined as being a state, and sometimes it's defined as not.
What I'm actually thinking is I'm not thinking something that simple, and I haven't got it quite worked out. But those words locally inapplicable and the Federal Relations Act were designed to put Puerto Rico in a status that isn't, in practice, quite that of a territory, although it's not a state. It's a commonwealth. It's the Estado Libre Asociado. And no one knows exactly what that is.
So, so how this is relevant is that, for all intents and purposes, we're a foreign country. A lot of laws that most Americans, or I would say most, I'm not going to say all, most Americans take for granted just don't apply in Puerto Rico. And they don't just apply in Puerto Rico, they don't apply in most of the 5 territories that exist now. So the current list of territories are, starting with Puerto Rico, which is the largest in population in the Caribbean. Then we have our neighbor right next to us, which is the United States Virgin Islands. They were bought, by the Dutch, I think it was? Or I should say America bought it from the Dutch. Then you go to the South Pacific, and the easiest way I went to figure out how to explain it is that everybody knows where Hawaii is, which is out in the middle of nowhere. So you go south, and then you hit American Samoa. And that go up the island chain, and you get to Guam, and then a little bit past that, because they were all part of the Northern Mariana, they were all part of the Mariana Islands, and then they split. So Northern Mariana Islands, I think it's sort of like 12 of those islands, I think only 6 of them are populated because the rest of them are volcanoes. It's like the deepest part of the Atlantic, the Pacific, and we're in Puerto Rico with the deepest part of the Atlantic Ocean. Yes, I geek out about stupid stuff like this. But the current 5 have a lot of issues where, we don't have we have technically a representative in Congress. We have no say. We can't vote on anything. We don't vote on presidential, like all 5 of us don't vote on presidential. And we can't become states. So this goes all the way back, like 120 odd years. It was 1898 is when Spain and the United States started having a tiff. At that point, you had basically imperial America basically dominating just about everything, because people keep forgetting. This is where the historical context thing, where I find interesting and people just go, the United States didn't have 50 states at that point. In fact, in early 1800s, they didn't even have 40 states. Half of it still belonged to, France. You had Spain that owned like half of it, and you just go on, and then Russia owned Alaska. So you had all of this area where there were I hate using the word, but invaded a whole bunch of other territories, had a whole bunch of wars, and some were being able to be bought, like in, like Virgin Islands in the early 1900s, and then even Russia in I think it was late 1800s, I think that was. Hawaii was also, there's a whole thing that goes to Hawaii that I'm actually interested in doing a separate video if I can get the right person to talk about that. But all of this, and why is this interested now, is that at the time that all of these territories, in fact, at the time was the whole fight was basically to get Cuba. And so Spain had owned everything in the Caribbean and like South America. Like they owned everything at that point. They were the largest empire on this side. In fact, none of y'all would have known us were here had it not been for the Spanish. And that was 1492. Yay! So we had all of this territory in the south in the Caribbean, and the United States wanted to, I think they wanted to either buy Cuba or buy Puerto Rico. That's its own thing. Spain kept saying no, and then they went to war over it. Spain lost badly because by that point their empire was very much dwindling, and so they ended up getting rid of the Philippines, Guam, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. And again, there's a whole video you can do of what happened to Cuba and who technically still owns it and all this extra stuff and whatever. Then Puerto Rico is what I'm going to be focusing on there. The Philippines fought the United States for like, 30 years and then finally gained independence. And then Guam, I'm not even sure at this point what their political status is because in terms of what they want. And the reason why I bring the what they want part is that has always been the argument against Puerto Rico. In the beginning, the whole concept is whenever you basically lost in a war, you became property. And property is fine, except for when there's people in there. And so you had the issue specifically with the ones that were acquired from Spain, that all of a sudden, out of nowhere, they weren't allowed to become a state. And at that point, those were 4 of the territories. It has since now become law in something called the insular cases, and insular meaning island. So at that point, when you try to explain it to people as to why this happened, and again, 100 and something years ago, you have to look at perspective. At the time, 2 years before the invasion, Plessy versus Ferguson was a thing. What is Plessy versus Ferguson? Plessy versus Ferguson was a Supreme Court case in 1896, I believe, late 1800s, that codified segregation. So you had issues where now the entire black community were sub-citizens, separate citizens. You know, it took this separate but equal thing. And that went on for 50 years, all the way up to, 1954, 1952, 56. I think it's 54. I'm sure in the comments you'll but it's just, at that point, it makes sense when you think about how that kind of racism could have happened, that an entire populace, I mean, it's in the Supreme Court cases, I think there's a core, like 6 to 8, and it can go as high as 24 because it's been basically solidified through different types of cases for the past 100 years. And so one of those cases, I believe, is this one. And why I even care about any of this is because of what's actually at stake. In the past, you've had issues, in the most recent, I would say, and last, 20, 30, 40 years, which was recent for me because I was still, in high school at that point. And so the case with this one involves a single man. So it isn't like a corporation or maritime law or some other law type administrative thing. This is a person. So the short, I think I mentioned in the previous video, what I had mentioned was, so this man, I believe is Jose Luis Vaello Madero. For those who are trying to figure out what the separation names are, Vaello is the paternal last name, which is what most last names are. So that's why a lot of Latin, and actually most of them I think came from Spain. I may be incorrect, but I've always associated the 2 last names with anything coming from Spain. So Mr. Vaello Madero, born and raised in Puerto Rico, came to the United States, specifically New York, similar to my mom, actually my dad more specifically, because he came in as an adult and they both came in as adults, met, married, they had kids, I guess. I don't know. The normal life worked. And then as he got older, he got, I believe it's a series of strokes. There's a podcast I'll link in the description as to the specifics as to what exactly happened. And he was not able to work. And so there is a law that provides financial assistance to the poor. And I always tie it to like Social Security insurance, and it isn't. It's like supplemental insurance, blah, 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 whatever it is. It's a program that is federal, meaning the United States government does it to individual people. I mean, the threshold is low. I mean, you can't make more than like $7,000 a year, which is nothing. So this is literally the poor. And so he obviously, when he applied, he got it, and it was receiving benefits. And he was still sick. And I mean, he's disabled. He's not able to work. He's not doing well. And his wife had gotten sick at this point, and they just made the decision to go back home. Oh, this is the part where I start getting... So he goes back home, and that's Puerto Rico. In Puerto Rico, that SSI doesn't exist there. We're not allowed to, because of the insular cases, to receive that money, even if we're dirt poor. We're supposed to be like accepting, like, it's like something like, I don't know, instead of hundreds of dollars a month, you get like $50 a month. It's dumb. You can't live off of that. I mean, you can barely live off of Social Security. SSI to begin with. And so it started to have a bigger issue where he, again, people keep thinking it's American citizen. You have this. The Bill of Rights does not apply to us. Thanks to what happened with the insular cases, all of these different cases, we're foreign, in a domestic sense, which is the dumbest thing I've ever heard. But that is what the law is, and has been for past 100+ years. And normally it wouldn't affect me anywhere near as much, so I thought. Again, I was born in the United States, and in my mind I kept thinking, I've already made my decision. I very much identify more as like American, allá afuera, meaning out there, as if we're like next to the moon or something. And I'm very much American in terms of my mannerisms, how I do things, how I think, all this extra thing. And I kept thinking, well, it's a decision that the Puerto Ricans on the island that were born there should have a right to, decide their own thing. The problem is that they have. And they have several times. In fact, most recent was the 2020 election. Most people didn't pay attention to that because they were looking at the Trump Biden election fiasco, that whole thing. Nobody was paying attention to what was going on in Puerto Rico. But in Puerto Rico, they made the first of the votes that actually had a clear-cut yes or no. Do you want to become a state? Yes or no. And yes won. Before, they used to have like these different categories, and some people were boycotted. It was just a mess. But everything changed around Hurricane Maria. For anyone that's not familiar, I still have the majority of my family in Puerto Rico. It's a cross between that's my home, damn it, and I can't afford to leave. It's the cross between the two. And quite frankly, you shouldn't have to leave your damn home. That's your home. That's your home. So I can go on forever about that, but in terms of this case, when he got back home, when he got to the age where you get the normal Social Security benefits, or I think it's like 65-ish, something to that effect, 65, 66, something like that. He went to the Social Security office because Social Security does exist in Puerto Rico, but not SSI. And so that's when he found out that not SSI. So they mentioned to him that he should not have been getting it, and that they're going to send it, back. And he's like, well, okay, whatever. And they never told him that he wasn't supposed to get it. They just straight up sued him. And so this went on, all kinds of different things that happened. There's, if you want to know the specific problems that happened in between, but he ended up winning in the, I think it's the district level, which would have been, the whole Northeast, because it's coming out of New York. And then he won at the federal level, which is the, I get decided, district or the different levels. You had this basically local and then the bigger, and then each time the government kept suing him, like they want their money back. But you start asking, it's like, what, how did basically an invalid like piss off the government? And again, this goes back to insular cases. So I sat and I became aware of this case when it was going up to the Supreme Court level, because I pay attention to these things. Had it not been for the fact that it had gone to the Supreme Court level, because I'm a geek, I listen to these things. And so I had noticed, because Puerto Rico consistently, and in fact, Guam especially, because between Puerto Rico and Guam, we keep suing the federal government and losing every single time because of insular cases. It kept frustrating me, and then this one seemed different because of what happened. I mean, the dude is currently facing 5 years in jail and restitution of all the money, which is 28 grand, and I'm sure interest and all the rest of that stuff. Simply because he went home. So if Puerto Rico are American citizens, why are we being sued for getting benefits? So I'm curious as to what the end of this thing is going to be. They had the oral arguments in November, and they have until the end of the term, which is the end of June. It's interesting, Justice Breyer announced that he was leaving, but he's going to finish out the term, so he is part of this. And whoever is confirmed to replace him, because right now, I think they just finished, was it Judge Jackson? But they haven't, as of the time of this recording, they haven't confirmed her yet. She won't be able to, or anyone is not going to be replacing until the end of the term, which would be at earliest June. So it could be any time from now to June that we get a decision on this. There are, I believe, 3 separate cases, and more along the line, that are on a holding pattern to figure out what's going to happen with this one. And that's the reason why I think it's important, because if the insular cases are used as a basis. Now, anyone that's going to sit down and try to listen to the oral arguments, they're trying to figure out the difference between rational basis and strict scrutiny. Rational basis is, in layman's terms, the government has a right to discriminate against you so long as they have a really good reason. That's basically what rational basis is. That's the government's position. And they've lost twice already, but anyone that's watched Supreme Court cases, it can go in any direction. Then you have strict scrutiny, is where, if my understanding is correct, is that there is a compelling reason to go back to what the original thing was if there was a discrimination component of it. And in our case, absolutely. The whole premise of the insular cases, why they were even a territory, why they have no rights as whatever, was based on the original insular cases. Dow specifically, we were deemed to be savages, incapable of understanding Anglo-Saxon principles, and therefore, for that reason, they cannot ever become a state. Because we don't understand it, we'll never be able to understand it. They come from a completely different line because we were part of the Spanish Empire. We didn't have rights under the Spanish Empire either. So I don't know what the hell they were talking about. But even if that were the case, 100 and something years ago, you would think that by now we would have figured it out. I am prime example. I am American, born and raised, almost 50 years. We know. And we've made a decision. Yes, we want to be a damn state. So in this particular case, all he wants to do is not go to jail. So how this is going to be, what's the phrase? Resolved? I'm thinking in Spanish now. How all of this is going to be resolved is totally up to... So are they going to leave it to Congress again, who's basically abdicated is the phrase? Their responsibility for over 100 years? Is the Supreme Court kind of gonna actually figure out? Because I was really interested in specifically Judge Gorsuch.
We don't think that the court needs to address the insular cases here any more than it did last year in Aurelius, where it noted that the court has repeatedly declined to extend the insular cases. It declared that in Reed against Covert in the 1950s.
Counsel, if that's true, why shouldn't we just admit that the insular cases were incorrectly decided?
Well, I think that that would not be the court's normal course to just say that several cases
I'm
were
asking for the government's position. I'm not asking for thoughts about the court's normal course. From the government's point of view, if the insular cases are wrong, and if you're proceeding on a premise inconsistent with them, why shouldn't we just say what everyone knows to be true?
Well, I don't think we're proceeding on a premise that's inconsistent with the insular cases, because
I think you've said that you're proceeding on a premise that the Constitution applies fully and without exception in respect to this claim, right?
With respect to the equal protection claim, yes.
So why not
but I don't think that that's the only thing that the insular cases decided.
What is the government's position on the insular cases?
The government's position on the insular cases is that some of the reasoning and rhetoric there is obviously anathema, has been for decades, if not from the outset, but that they are not at issue in this case, because the conclusion that parts of the Constitution wouldn't apply to Puerto Rico doesn't decide anything that is relevant to this case. The equal protection component applies here, and therefore, just as in Aurelius, the court doesn't need to say anything else about the insular cases in order to decide this case.
So what I found interesting about what Justice Gorsuch was talking about is that this is actually the first, to my knowledge, this is the first time that the United States government was actually pinned to make a decision as to what they feel about the insular cases. Because remember, that was during the time of Plessy. So Plessy was overturned with Brown versus Board of Education. And that ended segregation, and then we went into the civil rights, and then it had the whole extra thing. We haven't gotten our Board of Education decision. We haven't gotten a reversal of. Now, so what would happen if it was reversed? A whole lot of nothing, maybe? Don't know. But to this particular case, should he go to jail for being an invalid? I mean, it's like, I don't get it. So I spent a lot of time trying to analyze, is it just me? Is this actually happening? Like, we don't have a say in Congress. I do, because I'm now living in New Jersey. Born in Pennsylvania, live in New Jersey. If I had an argument or anything, I can just go to my representative. They don't have that. Sure, they can go to their representative, but what's that going to do? Nothing. So now I sit and I'm paying attention to how this whole thing is happening. And the part that really hit me, and it was with that podcast where I paid attention to the human aspect of this, because he's not the only one that's going through this. He just happens to be the one that is in the Supreme Court. I mean, started under the Trump administration suing him, then now with the Biden. I'm more frustrated with the Biden one, because he went on to say that Puerto Rico should become a state.
I'm going to work with representatives who support each of the status options in Puerto Rico on a fair and binding process to determine their own status. I happen to believe statehood would be the most effective means of ensuring that residents of Puerto Rico are treated equally, with equal representation at a federal level. But the people of Puerto Rico must decide, and the United States federal government must respect and act on that decision. And this much is certain. A Biden-Harris administration will always have the back of every single American when they get knocked down.
Got into power and immediately forgot. Like, we voted for it and then whoop, which is, again, this is normal for the past 120 something years. It doesn't matter what the political party is and whatever. Nobody cares for us. And that's the thing, you know, when I have my conversations with both my parents about this, and why I get emotional is that they're already elderly. They're in their 70s. They're both really sick. They can never go home. You know, whatever little that they managed to accumulate here, which was little because we grew up poor. I mean, working poor, but still poor. They'll lose it as soon as they get there. In fact, the thing that really got me was, again, listening to, he was sued during Hurricane Maria. I mean, put that in your mind. Here you are, your wife is sick, you're sick. All you just want to do is basically die in dignity. That's the thing that I just want to go home to be around my family for the last days of my life. And that's a crime. That frustrated me so much, going, dude, you have no sense of morality? And then you start going through the 100 and something years of everyone that has gone through this. Now, this particular law, this particular case, started the year I was born, ironically, 1972, when Social Security became a thing, where the federal, and it was it is still a great program. Federal government's like, if you're poor and you're sick and you need money, here is SSI. And it's only the government that its own thing. So it's not like different states that have their own. No, this is, you don't get the money through your state, you get the money from the Fed. So it's completely separate to any of the others. But there are so many, and in fact, one of the cases is people retroactively suing them for being denied because they were in Puerto Rico. It's like, if you don't care about this, don't make us American citizens. Just literally remove it, because the Bill of Rights doesn't mean anything to us. It doesn't apply. We don't have, in fact, we don't even have the right to a jury trial. We don't. That was, I forget which case that was. I forget which case that was. I'll put it in the description. And and that was a unanimous decision. Going, you're foreign. We don't give a crap. And this is law 100 years later. It's like, oh my God. Like, somebody please. So when I'm hearing Gorsuch turn around going, can we all agree that this is bullcrap? I was stunned. Now, would that translate to votes? I don't know. And that's been the discussion. Like, whenever I start talking about it to anybody, they're like, I was like, oh, isn't that going to affect a whole bunch of... Yes, it's going to affect a lot. If that's the case, we wouldn't have women's suffrage. We wouldn't have Title IX. That's... Now everybody wants to... It's not even that. There's a small vocal minority who wants to get rid of that. We're no longer women. What the hell? We wouldn't have... basically, blacks would still be property. I mean, like... all of these different things that caused a cascading effect on different laws. How about the law really sucks and let's get rid of it? Figure out where it happens after that. I mean, just literally, is that going to affect millions of people? Yes. In fact, it affects 4 million people, because 3 point whatever in Puerto Rico. And even that, because that's fluctuating like crazy, because there's 9 million total of us. So we're like 5.8-ish. So roughly 6 million in the United States, and then roughly 3 million in Puerto Rico. 9 million of us, and we're kind of going all over the place. We're sort of like the Borg. We'll assimilate with anybody.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
I mean, look at me. I got a German last name. And so, but it's just, it's that inability of like, well, maybe we can do a narrow scope. No, bullcrap. Get rid of it all. Start all over again. And as for a corrupt government, yes. So I'm sorry, Trump was right with that one.
You have incompetent, totally grossly incompetent leadership at the top of Puerto Rico. The people of Puerto Rico are great. And the people of Puerto Rico like me, and they should, because nobody's given them what I give them. But the leadership is corrupt and incompetent.
So the issue here is that just about 10 days ago, a giant group text message about 900 pages long came out showing Rosselló talking to his top aides. They made misogynistic, homophobic comments, and they were mocking Hurricane Maria victims. Well, that really validated what a lot of people thought, and now people really want Rosselló to leave, partly because they know that he's got no power here, and he can't work with President Trump and the White House to make sure that he can get more funds and recover from the hurricane and get the help that they truly need.
The government was corrupt. So here we are. Okay, great. So now you have, everybody wants to become a state now. That's great. That's fine. That's been like that for, 10 years now? Everybody keeps forgetting we've been wanting this for about 10 years. And more so now than even before. And you still have that government is in place. That's its own video. And I can go on forever. And there are so many different versions of that, to how can you say that, to yes, we should, what are the different ramifications. But for this particular case, which is why I had such a difficult time making this video, is that, okay, so in about a couple of months' time, we're going into midterm, so the politics of all of this, do you stand now that the United States should still have colonies? Because that's what we are. And last time I checked, y'all were really pissed off that you were a colony of England. And you destroyed some perfectly normal tea. Boston? Anybody? Y'all went to war with the help of France to get rid of colonialism. Yet you have colonies now. Blows my mind. Blows my mind. So, as I explained this to, friends, family, and actually even Puerto Ricans, because we're not taught this. You have to actively look for this. And like I mentioned way early in the video, I had made a decision all the way up to Hurricane Maria that whatever they wanted, yada yada or whatever. And it was sort of out of sight, out of mind, because I live here. I'm not moving to Puerto Rico. I've lived there before. And that is where I realize culturally, I really am bicultural. I have my Puerto Rican roots, both my dad won't even speak to me in English. I don't know if I could even understand if he tries, but he only speaks to me in Spanish. I went to school there when I was a kid. That's its own long discussion. I had left home when I was 15 and moved in Puerto Rico. So in Puerto Rico, that was a very interesting experience where it's very different when you're away from the capital and you go off what I call the paved road and live up in the mountains, and it's a whole different world. So on the legal sense, I can understand it's a separate country, but they kind of pick and choose when the hell they're going to use that, and that needs to stop. So ultimately, I don't know what's going to happen with this case, but I wish more people paid attention to it, because you as a general, not you in specific, really need to decide whether or not we need colonies at this particular state. Politically, everything's from, it reminds me again, the Hawaii-Alaska thing really keeps coming back to me. Remember, we haven't gotten our United States flag until the 50s, because we didn't have 50 states until then. And that's when we got, Alaska and Hawaii to fill out the rest of the union, the current union. So I'm hoping this dude does not go to jail. And I'm hoping that this will finally be settled. Yes, civil rights riots and all the rest of that happened for 15 years after that? I don't think that's going to happen, because quite frankly, no one gives a damn about Puerto Ricans, all 9 million of us. And, as for, And I actually had this question asked. Why isn't that you guys aren't more vocal about this? We were within one room of murdering a President Truman.
Outside Blair House, the president's temporary Washington home, extreme fanatics of the Puerto Rican Nationalist Party try to force their way in, guns blazing, to assassinate the President of the United States.
And there's still bullet holes in Congress when we decided, what was it, 1954?
Bullet holes can be seen in the House chamber from shots fired in 1954 by Puerto Rican nationalists.
March the 1st, 1954, and that's when the 4 Puerto Ricans entered the Capitol and the House gallery where I was working and began to shoot into the chamber.
Police hurried to America's House of Representatives in Washington following an attack by 3 Puerto Ricans, including Rafael Miranda, who fired on the senators in the chamber. Fellow gunman Andres Condero and the woman member of the trio Lolita Lebron are hustled away from the menacing crowd. Firing more than 20 rounds from their Luger automatics, the 3 fanatics seriously wounded 5 senators.
So violence is not the answer. But man, can I understand it. So it's really frustrating. It's sort of like, what do we do? I think you talk to representatives? Well, you're not from our state. Duh! You know, what am I gonna have Spartacus and, you know, the freaking Menendez gonna be paying attention to what I say? No, they're not going to, and they haven't, and no one has. Whether they're Democrat, Republican, Independent, Socialist, Communist, doesn't matter who the hell. No one has done anything for 125 years. I'm hoping that changes, and this is what has been bothering me. So we'll see in the next couple of months. I'm still struggling again to figure out how to do the other videos, if anybody's even interested, because I even just a cursory search through YouTube, I haven't seen anybody caring about this. So if the insular cases are to be overturned in about a couple of months, right before a president or a congressional midterm, what the hell is the United States going to do with that? I'm actually eager to find out, because I'm pretty much a sadist. So until the next video, whenever that is, and however in what form, I hope you take the opportunity to just look at this case, and I'm curious as to what your thoughts are, if you can figure out the legalese. So anyway.